"Hello, Grant," she whispered softly. Her full chest was squeezed into a tight corset, barely contained by the fabric. Loose curls framed her face, adding a playful touch to her coquettish appearance. Her blue eyes radiated desire, perhaps even love. Grant felt utterly overwhelmed. To him, she was the most exquisite creature on earth. Every moment apart, he spent counting down the seconds until he could see her again. Only Sylvia, the woman he knew as Sylvie, wasn't sitting across from him. She was thousands of miles away, and her time came at a price. Margaret and Chad Amato raised 3 sons. The eldest, Jason Amato, wasn't Chad's biological child, but Chad adopted him when Jason was just 3 years old and cared for him as if he were his own. Together, Chad and Margaret had 2 more sons, Cody in 1987 and Grant in 1989. The entire family was very close-knit, always supporting one another. Margaret, a manager at a pharmaceutical company, and Chad, a clinical pharmacist, provided their children with excellent opportunities and a strong start in life. Chad also had a passion for airsoft and building computers, hobbies he eagerly shared with his sons. Margaret devoted her free time to nursing an emaciated former racehorse that had wandered onto their ranch by chance. Under her loving care, the animal blossomed. The eldest son moved out at 19 to start his own family, but he still visited his parents and brothers as often as he could. The younger sons, Cody and Grant Amato, were not only brothers, they were best friends. They did everything together and dreamed of one day pursuing the same education, landing the same job, driving identical BMWs, and buying their parents' large home once they moved from Florida to Tennessee to enjoy retirement. In 2018, Grant and Cody were on their way to making their dream come true. Both worked as nurse anesthetists, but while Cody stuck to the plan, Grant began to fall behind. The young man was fired after being caught stealing medication. He was already preparing to take it home when he was discovered. Grant was arrested and charged with theft, but the charges were quickly dropped. He had claimed that he was giving the drugs to patients because he disagreed with the dosages prescribed by doctors. If his claims had been true, it could have opened the door to numerous lawsuits against the clinic. After the firing, Grant became deeply depressed and rarely left the house. He was fully supported financially by his parents and brother. They didn't pressure him, although they believed it was time for him to move on from the incident and start looking for a new job. However, Grant seemed to lose all motivation to work. He spent night after night online, mostly gaming. He was sad, isolated, and where could that possibly lead? Grant Amato discovered a website featuring attractive women who, for an extra fee, would agree to chat with visitors, dance for them, or offer other forms of interaction. One particular woman from Bulgaria, named Sylvie, especially caught his attention. She was smart, stunning, and made Grant feel special. The man completely lost his head. Suddenly, he became someone else, someone better. He convinced Sylvie that he was a successful professional gamer, lived in a luxury apartment, and drove an equally luxurious BMW. The more Grant paid, the more attention he received from Sylvie. Time on the site cost him 90 tokens per minute. He routinely spent $600 for 5,000 tokens, just 56 minutes of chatting. At first, he spent 4 hours a night on the site, which cost him about $2,500. In addition, he sent Sylvie lingerie and adult toys. Grant's behavior increasingly spiraled out of control and began to resemble a full-blown addiction. But nearly 30 years old, he had every right to spend his money however he wanted, if only it had been his money. Because Grant wasn't working, he spent all his time talking to Sylvie or scrolling through her photos. Grant was financially supported by his parents and older brother, though not always willingly. It wasn't difficult for Grant to withdraw money from their bank accounts. At some point, his parents noticed the charges and asked where the $600 payments were going regularly. Grant explained that he was spending the money to promote his Twitch streaming channel. In other words, the money was going toward advertising, so he could grow his follower base. He promised that the expenses would soon pay off because streamers could earn a lot of money. Chad and Margaret were skeptical, but Cody stood up for his brother and promised to cover all of Grant's debts, just to help him get back on his feet. In December 2018, Grant and Cody, along with their friend Jericho Fine, went on a trip to Japan. All 3 were passionate anime fans and had long dreamed of visiting a studio and fully immersing themselves in the culture. The trip had been planned for a while. Naturally, all of Grant's expenses were covered by Cody. Everything was going well until just before a day of sightseeing, Grant told Cody and Jericho that he wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be joining them. But instead of resting at the hotel, he stole Jericho's bank card and used it at an internet cafe to chat with Sylvie. That same evening, Jericho discovered there wasn't enough money left on his card to even pay for dinner. He contacted Grant's parents, and they found out nearly all of the money had been spent on tokens. It quickly became clear that Grant had taken the card. Once again, Cody stepped in to cover for his brother, convincing Jericho not to go to the police and promising to pay him back in full. When the brothers returned home, the atmosphere in the house became more tense than ever. Their father, Chad, was deeply upset. Not only was Grant still unemployed, but he had no desire to change and continued to spend other people's money. After looking over bank statements, Chad discovered, to his horror, that the missing amount was far larger than he had imagined. A heated argument broke out, and Grant drove off in his car. Margaret contacted the police, afraid her son might harm himself. In reality, Grant had gone to his aunt's house and asked if he could stay with her. She immediately noticed that something was wrong. Her nephew seemed distressed, sleeping all day and staying up all night. Out of caution, she and her husband hid all the firearms in the house. A few days went by, and one day, Grant's aunt happened to check her bank account and saw some strange withdrawals. Hundreds of dollars had vanished. Her first thought was that she had fallen victim to scammers, but then she realized Grant had somehow obtained her personal information and had been spending nights on an adult website while the household slept. Grant's aunt called his father and told him what was happening. For the first time in her life, she heard Chad cry on the phone. He admitted that this had been going on for some time and that the family's debt had reached $150,000. Grant had even taken out a $65,000 loan secured by his parents' home. Chad said that he and Margaret had basically given up on retiring anytime soon, but were willing to make the sacrifice to keep their son out of prison. He promised to pay back every cent and pleaded with his sister not to press charges. Instead, Chad, Margaret, Cody, and Jason all came together and gave Grant an ultimatum. Either he would check into a rehab facility for his addiction, or they would cut him off completely. It's worth noting that Grant had always been a quiet, non-confrontational person, so he agreed without protest and entered treatment. Cody paid $15,000 for Grant's 60-day stay at the clinic. Back home, Grant's brother and father looked through his computer, and only then did they discover the extent of the false life Grant had been living online. They found out about Sylvie, as well as an entire group of her online admirers whom Grant had befriended. Grant had presented himself to them as wealthy and successful, but now his family told them the truth, that Grant wasn't rich, that he lived with his parents and depended entirely on their financial support, that he drove an old Honda, and most importantly, that the money Sylvie had been receiving came from funds stolen from Grant's family and friends. They asked Sylvie never to contact him again. Meanwhile, Grant spent 2 weeks in the clinic, after which he declared that he was completely cured. On January 5th, he returned home, hoping everything would go back to normal. But from the moment he walked through the door, he was told things would now be different. There would be new rules, no internet access at night, a phone without internet capability, and he would have to get a job and finally start paying off his debts. Otherwise, he could either move out or join the military. It was likely then that Grant was also hit with another shock, that Sylvie now knew the truth about him and would never speak to him again. Grant's father was essentially trying to open his son's eyes, to show him that he had chosen a stranger he'd never even met over his own family, and that now all of them were suffering because of his actions. Grant seemed to accept his father's words and agree to all the conditions. For a while, it seemed like Grant was genuinely trying to turn his life around. But then he persuaded his mother to let him borrow her phone so he could try to contact Sylvie through Twitter. Margaret was a very kind-hearted woman and couldn't bring herself to say no to her son. On January 24th, Chad found out that Grant had been using his mother's phone. He told him to pack his things and start looking for a new place to live. Then he left for work, and Grant quietly began packing his bag. On Friday, January 25th, 2019, the police received a call from one of Cody's friends and colleagues. He was worried because Cody Amato hadn't shown up for work and wasn't answering calls or messages. Cody had always answered his phone and had never been late for work before. At 9:17 a.m., officers went to the family home. The cars were parked in the garage, but no one answered the doorbell or knocking. The officers used a knife to open the lock and entered the house. On the kitchen floor, they found Chad's body. A chicken was thawing on the table, and a lunchbox lay on the floor. On his right thigh hung a holster with a pistol. It seemed like Chad had just returned from work, put down his lunch leftovers, took out the chicken for dinner, and was then shot from behind. Margaret was found in her office on the first floor. She had also been killed with a single precise shot. Cody, still in his work uniform, was lying near the garage door. Nearby lay 4 shell casings and 2 pistols. Overall, it appeared that Cody had killed his mother and father, then decided to follow them. The police had to inform the other family members about what had happened. They found Grant the next day at a hotel. At the station, the man cooperated and answered questions for 7 hours, discussing the family's recent months. He fairly openly admitted the debt he had accumulated and explained that his father had asked him to find a new place to live on the 24th. Grant added that his brother had promised to handle the problem. From his words, it seemed that after his brothers promised to deal with their parents, Grant left and didn't know what happened afterward. But here's the catch. If, as he claimed, he wasn't at home and knew nothing, then why during 7 hours of questioning did he not once ask why he was at the station and why the police were interrogating him? And if he was innocent, why did he drop to his knees and put his hands together as if to be handcuffed when the police knocked on his hotel room door? While the police were investigating the crime scene, Grant was allowed to talk with his older brother Jason, who begged him to tell the truth. He wanted to hear it from his brother, not from anyone else. But Grant insisted that Cody had promised to resolve the problem and kept his word. As Jason left, he told Grant he would pray for him because he could no longer pray for their mom, dad, and brother. Whether Jason believed him is unknown, but the police definitely did not trust Grant's words. First, Cody was found near the garage door, but there was no blood on the door behind him, meaning it was open at the time of the shooting and someone closed it later. Forensics found signs that Cody was shot from about a meter away. And finally, none of the pistols found near Cody matched the murder weapon, which was never found. There were many other pieces of evidence clearly indicating that Cody was the third victim, not the shooter. Grant was arrested and charged with the murder of his mother, father, and brother. Gloves and bank cards belonging to his brother and father were found in his possession. Bail was set at $750,000. Grant tried to get money by demanding his parents' insurance payout, but the judge forbade this outrageous idea. The trial began in July 2019. Grant's lawyer insisted that someone had broken into the house and killed the family. However, the evidence told a different story. It all started at 4:44 p.m. Cody and Chad were at work when Grant put on gloves, took a gun, went to his mother's office, and shot her in the back. About an hour later, the father came home. According to his fitness tracker, he immediately went to the kitchen and started preparing dinner, when his son quietly sneaked up behind him and pulled the trigger. Cody returned from his shift only at 10 p.m. He entered the house through the garage where his younger brother was already waiting for him. After that, Grant spent several hours tampering with the crime scene to make it look like Cody was responsible for killing their parents. He moved his brother's body, placed a weapon near him, and even put a gun holster on the father. The evidence also showed that around midnight, Chad logged into his banking app on his iPhone using his fingerprint and transferred money from his account to Grant's, even though he had been dead for a long time. Forensics examined the man's hands. Although they were covered in blood, one finger was completely clean. As horrible as it sounds, investigators had to conclude that Grant wiped his deceased father's finger to unlock the phone and transfer money to himself. Around 3 a.m., he took his brother's cards, got in his car, drove to a store parking lot where there was Wi-Fi, and spent several hours trying to win back Sylvie's favor. Grant Amato killed his family, including his brother, who was ready to give him the shirt off his back. And while their bodies were still warm, he rushed to restore a connection with a girl he had never even met in person. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found 29-year-old Grant Amato guilty of murdering his father, mother, and brother. He was spared the death penalty, but will spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. Grant was desperate to win Sylvie back and was willing to do anything to remove any obstacles in his way, even his loving family. Photos of the fatal beauty were shown on the courtroom screen, and even then, after everything he had lost, Grant couldn't take his eyes off her. Now he is serving his sentence in a Florida prison and admits that he often receives letters from women. It's unlikely that Sylvie's one of them.